Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome to episode 75 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. Normally released on Fridays, not religiously released on Fridays, even though most things I do are religious, but normally on Fridays. But today, on a very special edition of the podcast, being released on Thursday. Why? Because Thursday is All Hallows Eve. That's right. Thursday, October 31st in the year of our Lord, 2024, the day before All Saints Day, which is what Friday would be. I'm releasing this podcast because it's germane. So the book that I'm going to be talking about today with the author is a book called Exploring the Paranormal. And it's released by Eerdman's Publishing, and it's I got an advanced copy of it. I don't have a physical copy I can show you because I just had to read pixels for it. But what pixels? I will gush in the interview, so I'll save some of the gushing for then. But this is actually very interesting for me because this is, episode 75, 3/4 of the way to a century, and my first repeat guest. I had Dr. Streett on. To talk about this book, Caesar and the Sacrament, Baptism, a Rite of Resistance, which was, I don't know what number it was, but anyway, huge book for me. And when I saw that he was going to be releasing this book, I said, oh my goodness, I would really like the opportunity to talk to him about this. And so it's all worked out. This book is bananas. I'll talk more about it in the conversation. So it's about his life story as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the world of the paranormal, psychics, trance mediums, all the weird and wacky things. And I'll tell you what, it was so engaging because it's his story. And then at the end, he builds this really kind of intricate scientific philosophy about how it works, how the spiritual world interacts with the physical world. And I got to tell you, and if you're listening to this, Dr. Streett, I'm not sure I like it. I'm not sure I like the conclusions. And it won't matter if I like it or not because they're, scientifically proposed conclusions. And so if you decide to read the book or engage with the content at all, it might be something that's right up your alley. It might be something that goes right over your head, or it might be something that you totally connect with, or it could be, like me, it rubs against you the wrong way a little bit in some of its conclusions, and maybe what we're left with in terms of like how we can explain so much of kind of our spiritual interactions. I don't think there's any way around our desire as humans to do this. I think we're kind of stuck in some respects. It's like we have to try to explain anything that we feel like we can explain. It's not possible to just say, I don't know, or I don't want to know, right? We feel compelled and drawn forward. I'm kind of freaked out about it, to be honest with you. So that's where I was left a little bit. It's not that I disagree; it's that I'm disturbed by some of the fullness of the explanation that he gives. But nonetheless, it could be something that's really important for some people to be able to think through, and the way that he works through it all in the book, I don't know, it was pretty mind blowing. So I don't know if this is a glowing endorsement or not. I speak very highly about how it's written and the kind of content that's in it, and yet I will say I'm left unsure as to whether I should like some of the conclusions of it. You're obviously going to have to be the one to judge that. Exploring the Paranormal by Eerdman's Publishing, written by the masterful Alan Streett, whom I'm going to have a conversation with right now. I hope you enjoy that. So the first time that I had you on the podcast, Alan, we talked about your book, Caesar and the Sacrament, which actually since then, what's been interesting is I have, in my kind of primary role at the church that I serve, I've shifted from kind of worship primarily over towards the discipleship area, which means that I actually have the opportunity to kind of guide and oversee our baptism process. And so that book has become clutch for me. I love to dig into that and help people see how allegiance to Christ is really kind of the key thing that happens in there. And so you've done some wonderful spade work there for us. And yeah, you've got that book. You've got Rites of Resistance, the Meals of Resistance. Is that what it's called? Or?
Right. I got one on meals.
Meal. That's the communion book.
Yeah, that's a good book. Really. And it's
a great book.
Yeah, it's a good book.
You got worship you got songs, you know, you've got worship stuff, kind of taking a look back to the kind of history of how song and worship kind of interplay in the life of the church. You've written a number of books. I don't think you've written one about ghosts before, have you?
No, I haven't. But there was a time when I was a cult researcher. And
Yes.
as a result of that, I guess I had files on about 12 or 1,500 different groups in America. So had a ministry, of sort of an apologetics type ministry at one time.
Right.
Finally gave that up, but so I do have a lot of experience. But this is the first time I put it together.
You do, yeah. And so, you know, for somebody who is just kind of reading along with your prior work, which I was, when you started posting online about this book, I was like, this seems like a turn. But this is because I didn't really know your kind of biographical sketch.
Right.
So the book here, which is wonderfully titled "Exploring the Paranormal," coming to us from Eerdman's Publishing. I haven't had a chance to hold it in my hands, but I've read an e-copy of it, and I got to say, I was like, it was a digital page turner. Every step along the way, especially for the first probably third to a half of the book, my mouth was agape. I was literally like just slack-jawed because of the story and the way that you tell it. You do it in a very interesting way where I'm sure this is partially intentional. Certainly your views on the paranormal evolve throughout the book, but as your chronology goes, it seems like you're trying to present to us in narratival form not only the events, but the way that you understood the events at the time. So it's like your consciousness evolves. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So my goal is to carry the reader along with me on the journey, so they are right where I am on each page. And then my hope is that they will evolve after reading the book to where it took me 50 years to get. Well, it took me 50 years to evolve to this point. I'm hoping they can do it in 180 pages or 200 pages.
Right. So, I mean, I feel like, you know, and I want to encourage people to pick up the book and read it, but I feel like maybe if we can just kind of dip into your biography in some respects, because it really is your biography that frames the book. Yeah. You grow up not a particularly religious character. Is this right?
That's correct. I believed in God, but that was about it. I'd look up in heaven and I'd say, "Are you up there, God?" And that was about the extent of my religious upbringing.
Right. And you say that sometimes you'd pray for the ability to hit a home run or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. Because you were a baseball player. Is that right?
I was a baseball player. And so, yes, the only time I prayed was when I needed to get a hit.
Yeah. Did it work?
But that's when I prayed, you know. I think that's how most people pray. They have a need and they pray for the need. And in this case, I was trying to play professional baseball. And so it was important that I played to top of my game. And, you know, I'd ask for divine guidance and help.
Right. And did it work for you?
I probably would not have given God credit. I'd probably give myself credit.
I see. Okay. So not sure about the testability of your efficacy rate on the hits. Yeah. So, but somehow you end up attending kind of seminary. So why was that the case for you?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. Is that in college I had a few paranormal encounters with people, I would say, and experiences that led me on a journey to search and discover the origin and nature of these experiences. And so that's how I got involved in the occult. And first of all, it was in college before I went to seminary. And so, as I say in my book, I injured my arm. And that was devastating because my goal was to play professional ball. And I was hoping to get signed by a professional team. And in my last year of college, I hurt my arm severely. And nothing worked. I mean, I had cortisone treatments, did everything. I mean, I even went to the racetrack and a horse liniment and rubbed it on my shoulder, hoping that would work. Nothing worked. And I was finally forced to go to an orthopedic surgeon. And this sort of reveals my age, because when this happened to me. They didn't have MRIs. They couldn't look inside your body and determine what was wrong with you. So the surgeon said the only thing we can do is an exploratory surgery to check it out. And I had a terrible fear of dying on an operating room table. I don't know where that fear came from, but it gripped me. Fear of death. And so, to make a long story short, my mother happened to be reading a book about a psychic healer, world-famous psychic healer. And that healer just happened to live in the city where we resided, which was Baltimore, Maryland. And my mother said, why don't you go see Olga Warhol? Now, anybody that's listening to your program can look her up on Wikipedia or any book that's ever on the occult, and she plays a prominent role. And so I went there to see if she would heal my arm. She laid her hands on me and prayed for me, and nothing happened. I was disappointed. She recognized I was disappointed. She said, hey, why don't you meet me after this meeting, and we'll go to lunch. And she introduced me to psychic phenomenon, and I, as a result of that, got drawn into the exploration of psychic phenomenon. And there's an organization known as the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship. It's still in existence, but it was founded by 3 clergymen. And they wanted to rediscover the psychic gifts or the supernatural gifts that were experienced in the first century church. They wanted to reintroduce that into the church in the 20th century. And they started an organization called Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship. And I got drawn into that, went to their meetings. They discussed psychic phenomenon and all that kind of stuff. One of the men who founded it was a man named Arthur Ford, who was a trance medium. In fact, he was the most famous trance medium probably who ever lived.
What's a trance medium?
Trance medium is a person who will go into a trance, supposedly release their spirit, and the spirits of the departed come into their body and speak through their vocal cords. And they bring message. And then they would hold what we would, in modern language, be called a seance. But that's not what psychics call. They call it a sitting or a reading. The psychic gives you a reading and goes into the trance, and voices speak through him, and you are able to communicate with the divine or with spirits on the other side. And Arthur Ford broke the Houdini code. Some of you know that when Houdini died, his wife tried to make contact with him, and supposedly she did through Arthur Ford, this trance medium. And then later on, he held a seance for Bishop Pike, very controversial bishop of the Episcopal Church, and made contact supposedly with his dead son. So I was reading books about these people. I was interacting with these people. And so I was very interested in spiritual things at this point. My interest got pricked.
Sure.
And one day I went to the dean at the University of Baltimore where I was a student, told him, he said, you ought to go to seminary. So through his efforts, I entered seminary. And so this is how I end up in seminary. I'm not a Christian, but I'm just interested in spiritual things. And I said, well, I don't think I should go to seminary. He said, well, that's where you can find yourself, So I went to seminary. And so now I'm learning some Bible passages, but I'm still involved in psychic phenomena. I didn't see any contradiction.
Well, and clearly it seems like this person also didn't see any contradiction, right? That's why they recommended that you went to seminary, or were they hoping to save your soul? I don't really know what the motivation behind it was.
The dean was a former Methodist minister, and he said, "Oh, John Wesley had a lot of psychic experiences. Maybe you ought to go to the seminary named after him, Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C." And so that's where I went. And when I got there, it was very interesting because I took a class called Mysticism East and West, and the professor invited in guest speakers. And one of the speakers he invited in was a man named Ted Swagger, who was the protege of Arthur Ford. He, too, was a trance medium. And we hit it off. We went to lunch. We had a great discussion. We became great friends. And I got drawn in more and more and more. And I actually considered being a trance medium myself when I graduated from seminary. He and Ford were like father and son. And he would travel 2 days a week and study trance mediumship with Ford. And when Ford was sort of dying and was, he was not able to do psychic readings and trance readings anymore, my friend Ted basically took over his ministry, because that's what Ford considered it, a ministry.
Right.
It was a Christ ministry. The men who founded the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship were all ministers. Algo Warhol's father was a professor was a Russian theologian. He was a professor of theology. They all did things in the names of Jesus, in the name of Jesus.
Right.
So for me, it seemed like, well, I'm a Christian, aren't I? I mean, if you're not Jewish, you're Christian. You're not Muslim, you're a Christian. I thought I was a Christian. So I thought, well, this has to be okay. And I just got drawn in more and more and more.
The 1960s or 1970s?
This would be late 60, beginning 70, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. My gosh. So, I mean, I want to eventually get to this, because what the SFF, or the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship over there, the SFF for short. What they're kind of doing is saying, like, trying to reintroduce essentially the psychic gifts, or what I think many of us might be more comfortable saying as a charismatic gifts, reintroducing the charismatic gifts into the church.
Seeing the Bible miracles is the same thing they're doing.
Right. I mean, I'm hoping that we can maybe drill into, if time allows, how it seems like that approach is so kind of wildly different from the standard charismatic approach, which is also happening in different churches at the same time.
Sure.
But I don't want to lose the thread necessarily of where we're at. So late 60s, early 70s, you're interested in this stuff, and so you go to what is called Wesley Theological Seminary, which is crazy. As a Wesleyan myself, so you go to this place, and you're kind of able to both study these things and also study you're studying the Bible, and you're studying psychic phenomenon with people who see apparently no contradiction in that, and you feel like maybe this is something that you can do. Like, it's not just somebody that receives certain giftings, it's something like an art or a skill that people can acquire and kind of develop. Is that the impression?
It's a discipline. Through meditation, you can learn to meditate and go into an altered state and supposedly become so passive that spirits from the other side could come in and speak through your vocal cords, or maybe through this passive state, you will be given insight and wisdom that you didn't have in your conscious state to help people. So you can see how people that were doing this would consider it a ministry.
Sure. Well, people benefit from it. I mean, or they feel like they're benefiting from it. It's why they do it, why they go for it, right?
Right.
But you're also, the way that you just described it there, you have a pretty low bar identity as a Christian. Like, I happen to be somebody who's not Jewish or Muslim, therefore a Christian.
Right.
So, but I know from, spoiler alert from your other story, and the ways that we've talked in the past, that obviously Christianity becomes a key identifier for you, something that's very, very important. So what's the switch there? How do you kind of move from somebody who is pretty nominal at best towards somebody who's kind of bought in?
It's just it's the strangest thing. I had a professor who gave a lecture one day, and he put the word God at the top of a blackboard and the word man or humans down at the bottom. And he said, between man and God, there's a big gap. And you may feel separated from God. And he said, but I want you to know, he said, that in God's mind, he's not separated from you. That's what he said. Now, I didn't quite understand it all, but he put a great big cross between God and human beings. He said, because of what Christ did on the cross, man and God have been reconciled. So we're one with God. That's what he said. And he said, you need to accept the fact that you're accepted, that God accepts you just as you are. Well, I couldn't believe that, because I knew how I was. I mean, I couldn't even accept myself. I was on the verge of being an alcoholic. I'd go out and get drunk every night. And I was just a mess. And I was even pastoring a church, because at Wesley Seminary, they didn't even allow you to graduate unless you pastored a church for a year, at least be a student pastor of a church. So I was pastoring a church part-time. And my folks didn't realize what I was like. They thought I was a good guy, you know. But I'd be out drunk on Saturday night before I got up and preached on Sunday. If they knew how I really was, they couldn't have accepted me. And I would look in the mirror in the mornings and I would say, man, you're a real bum. How can you're a hypocrite, you know? And so I couldn't believe that God accepted me. If I couldn't accept myself, how could God accept me? He said, but you need to accept the fact that you're accepted. And when he did that, I don't know what happened, but I went to my room and I sat down in this big old overstuffed chair and I said, oh God, you can't accept me like I am. And I don't know what happened. I can't explain it, but it just seemed like the power of God came into that room and just descended. And I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. And all I could do was cry. And I said, oh, God, help me. Oh, God, help me. I'm so sorry. And when I did that, I mean, and the power of God stayed in that room for 2 hours. I could not move. And when it lifted, suddenly my life was totally changed. I was radically saved. I don't even know how it happened. This is the truth. I don't know how it happened. It was a miracle. But there were 3 evangelical students at the seminary, and they heard of my experience, and they came to me and said, hey, and they were all so excited, you know. They knew how I was before. They avoided me before because I was a bum. Now they heard about my experience, and they were so excited. And he said, hey, why don't you go to church with us tomorrow night? I said, Tuesday night? Who goes to church on Tuesday night? I said, well, this church is a different kind of church. It's a charismatic church. I never heard of that in my life. But I went there, and the speaker was a man named Dennis Bennett, known as the father of the charismatic movement. He had a charismatic speaking in tongues type of experience, and he shared it with his church. And basically, he got transferred to another church. He got in trouble, sort of. But he was speaking that night, and he said, tonight I want to speak on the occult and the dangers of the occult. And he just laid out all the scripture passages that talk about what he called counterfeit gifts. He said there are a lot of people doing so-called supernatural things. He said, but they're not gifts from God's Holy Spirit. They come from another spirit, a demon spirit, and they're counterfeits. And he said, if you've been involved in this, he said, you're in danger and you need to ask God to deliver you. And he gave an invitation, and I went forward that night. He just sort of laid hands on me. Now, Olga laid hands on me a few years before, the psychic. And now Miss Bennett lays hands on me, and I don't know, but it just seemed like a weight lifted off my shoulders. And suddenly I said, I've been deceived for these years. What I've been doing is not from God, but was demonic. And so that's how my perspective changed. It changed in an instant. And then I said, I need to write my friend Ted Swager and tell him that what he's been doing is wrong. And I didn't hear back from him for about 1.5 years. I finally graduated from seminary and was in the ministry. And one day I got a phone call from him. He said, Al, he said, this is Ted. He said, I've been delivered. And Ted read my letters. He began to get convicted. He looked up scriptures, and he became convinced that what he was doing was not from God. And he gave it up. And so that was where I stayed for the next several years, thinking that all this was from the devil. There was a real gift from the Spirit, and then there was a counterfeit gift from the Spirit. So that was my next stage in evolution. But then I had a third stage, and now let me just stop at this point, because probably most of your hearers who are evangelical Christians would immediately label all things psychic as demonic. Or many of them.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, like, I'll roll in and say this was, and we'll see how it shakes out at the end, but let's just say this was, and maybe still is, my active view of psychic phenomena that occur outside of the person and work of Christ or the Holy Spirit. I tend to think of them as bad.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's where I was. I'm convinced that was probably not where I needed to settle down. I think that, as you'll see as my story unfolds, that is probably irrational in some ways. Because I'll just throw this in, because when you look in the scriptures, Satan and the demons are very active, but you don't see them too much dealing with supernatural gifts. In other words, Satan's not healing people in the Bible. You see, Satan's not speaking to the dead through psychics in the Bible, things like that. So he does other things, and these demons do other, but that's not the realm that they're involved in. But that's where I was at that point. And then what happened was that I was teaching college. I got a job at a Bible college in Dallas, Texas, and I was teaching a class on the cults and the occult, theology of the cults. And I invited a speaker in who was a magician who could do psychic magic tricks. I don't know if you've seen Darren Brown and people like that are sort of famous out there. They're magicians do sleight of hand and illusions, but there's one class of magicians called mentalists. And mentalists do tricks of the mind. They claim they can read somebody's mind, tell you your birth date, tell you this and that, give you information about themselves, but it's all a trick. One of the most famous mentalists was a guy named Kreskin back in 80s and 90s, and there was a movie about him just about 10 years ago. It's a pretty famous movie. Kreskin did all these mental tricks, and he had one trick that was amazing. He would ask the host of the sponsoring event to hide his paycheck. Maybe it was a $10,000 fee that he charged for that event. And they could hide it anywhere in the theater. He would go outside, they would hide it, and he would come in and say, I will find my check. And if I don't find it, I will donate that $10,000 to the charity of your choice. And they would hide it. Now, this is a theater with 500 or 600 people, 1,000 people in it. He would walk in, he'd grab somebody's hand, and he would start circling the theater. And before long, he was able to spot where his check was hidden. In 30, 40 years of performing as a mentalist, he only failed once. Now, how did he do that? He said he did it through telepathy. They read the people's mind. But that's not what he did. He held someone's hand, and then he started dividing that theater into 4 parts. He would take them by the hand and move into one part of that theater, and guess what would happen? Well, people would be talking, and they'd say, oh, he doesn't know where it is. They'd be whispering to each other. And then he knew, because there was a little bit of rumble and discussion in the theater, that the check wasn't in that section. And then he would move with that person to the next section. Everything got quiet. And he knew, just because everybody got quiet, oh, he's getting hotter, And that's how he did it. And then by holding the person's hand, he could feel them resisting. When he got close to the check, they would resist just a little bit. When he moved away from the check, they relaxed their hand just a little bit. This is called ideomotor response. Our body gives off tells or little indications that reveal what's in our mind. So here he was holding this person's hand, and by holding their hand, he could feel these little ideomotor responses that revealed where that check was, because they knew it in their mind where it was, and they would lead him right to it. That sounds like psychic phenomenon, but guess what? It was all a trick. Everything was a trick.
Right.
So now I'm saying, guess what? It's possible that these people who claim to be psychics are just doing magic tricks, mentalism tricks.
Sure.
So now
is that
3 options?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the options are: it's from God? That's where I would believe the first time. It's from the devil. That was the second. Now it could be a magic trick. They're just fooling people. And the thing there's all kinds of little tricks that they learn. And one thing is called cold reading, where you just read people. For example, if I say to you, well, you've had some problems with your father. I'm a psychic, and you come to me, and I'm giving you a reading. I say, I've seen that you have some problems with your father. And if I see that your brow furrows a little bit, I know I've missed it. But if you nod, I know I got it. So if you go, oh, well, you sort of furrow. I said, it may not be your father, but I see this man in your life that you've either had some problems with or you're going to have some problems with in the near future. It doesn't matter what I say. It's always going to be right because I can read your expressions and I can adjust accordingly. So that's called a cold reading. And a hot reading is where I know you're going to come to me for some advice, and I just simply get on the internet and I search everything I can about you and I feed it back to you in a way that seems like I'm reading your mind. And Arthur Ford, the greatest trance medium of the 20th century, it was discovered that he researched his clients before they came to him for seances. And when that was discovered, it just blew the lid off of Arthur Ford's reputation and began to make people question whether trance mediumship was legitimate or whether they were all fakes. And so I came to the conclusion that they were all fakes. They were all they just learned mentalism tricks. They passed themselves off as legitimate psychic. So that was my third stage.
Right. It's your third one. And it would sound like a wonderful place to leave off, but it isn't where you leave off, right? The story continues.
Right, because there was a man named Daniel Hoy, who was a graduate of Bob Jones University, very fundamentalist school, and he became an evangelist. And he used magic tricks to evangelize people. Some magicians use magic tricks to do that. Some use drawings and things like that. And he then decided to become a mentalist. He left the ministry, decided to become a professional magician. Now, professional magicians do everything for entertainment purposes. Everyone knows it's just a trick, but they're getting fun out of it. And he became a mentalist. But then he decided to pass himself off as a legitimate psychic. He did it. He still used magic tricks, mentalism, but he had a totally different audience, and he passed himself off as a legitimate psychic. Every magician in the world knew he was a fake because they knew him before. But his audience thought he was real. So I thought, well, most of these people must be fakes. Even my friend Ted Swagger, who was a trance medium, I said, you got demons? Now I'm saying, well, maybe he was just a fake, like his protege, like Arthur Ford, his mentor. But then what happened was that, and this, now years have passed. I'm asked to teach a large Bible class at a big church in Dallas very early in the morning. And I accept that. Taught that class for 18 years. It was like 200 people in it. And I had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning in order to get ready for that class. And to wake up, I set my alarm to radio alarm to NPR. And it would go off at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I hear this voice, and the voice would say, "This is David Freudberg, and you're listening to Humankind." That was such a pleasant voice, nice voice to wake up to. And I would lay there for a few minutes, and the first program I heard was about a man named Henry Green. And if the people read my book, this will be fascinating for them. And even if they don't. Well, Henry Green is lying dying in the hospital. And he has a terrible heart problem. And he's expected to live for two more weeks. His doctor is making the rounds, and he's coming in, and he has a group of interns with him. They pick up Mr. Green's chart, they look at it, and the doctor says to the interns, "Mr. Green has a galloping heart." And they all shake their head and go, "Oh, yeah." And then they leave the room. Mr. Green hears that. He says, "If I have a galloping heart, it must be getting stronger." It's galloping. And he gets out of bed, he puts his clothes on, he checks himself out of the hospital and never comes back, and he's totally cured. And with mind over matter, it was a mental healing. And the crazy thing about it is, when the doctor said Mr. Green has a galloping heart, and the intern said, "Oh yeah, they all understood that meant he was on his last legs.
Right.
Because the galloping heart doesn't mean it's getting stronger. It means it's racing and it's ready to go out. Yeah. But Green didn't understand that. Green misinterpreted the statement. And when he did, something triggered in his mind, and immediately he was instantly healed. Now, that physician, by the way, won the Nobel Prize. This was not some secondhand type story that I'm recording. This is a story I heard, and I heard the physician tell the story, who happened to be a Nobel Prize winning physician from Harvard University. Right. So that was the first time I really thought, wow, maybe the mind can heal the body. And then the next week I heard Dr. Herbert Benson, who was also a physician. He was a cardiologist and a professor at Harvard Medical School. And he told the story of how he discovered the power of meditation to heal heart problems. Now, this is a world-class scholar. And he began to study meditation techniques, and he went all around the world and studied people who did meditation. And he discovered that when you meditate for 20 minutes a day, what happens is that you reach a state of calm and the stress melts away. And he realized that this is what his heart patients needed. They needed to be able to eliminate the stress in their lives. And he said, if you can meditate for 20 minutes a day, you will have what's known as a relaxation response that has healing power. And the relaxation response is the opposite of the fight or flight response. So if we're in a stressful confrontation or a dangerous situation, immediately we go into a fight or flight response. Either we'll fight the situation, resist, or we'll flee for our lives. But if you've been able to meditate for 20 minutes a day and you've been able to elicit the relaxation response, instead of being stressed out, you can actually handle the situation in a calm manner. And he discovered the relaxation response has the power to calm you and the power to heal you. I read every book this man wrote at that point. And I thought, well, I want to read more about the subconscious mind, because that's what you're dealing with now. You sort of allow your conscious mind to recede and your subconscious mind to come forth and sort of reach a state of calm. And I began to study the subconscious mind, and I discovered that the subconscious mind is very powerful. It's powerful to have intuitive insights. There's power to heal the body. And that led me to my next discovery, which was the brain waves. I discovered that there are 4 levels of brain waves. And each level of the brain wave is simply how fast the neurons in your brain travel throughout the brain in a second. And that first level is called the beta level. And that's the fastest movements of the neurons in the brain. That's when you're conscious. That's when you can work out detailed problems, analytical situations. You're wide awake during the day. Your critical mind is operating on all 8 cylinders. That's called the beta stage. But your mind can't operate at that stage forever. It needs a rest. And so your brain slows down into what's known as the alpha stage. And when that happens, you sort of go, you just relax, and maybe you'll start daydreaming for a few minutes, go get a cup of coffee, take a break, and you slow down. And I saw that so clearly when I was teaching. I'd be lecturing, had an hour and a half lecture. I'd give an hour and a half class, hour and a half, and I noticed some of my students, their eyes would just glaze over. At the beginning, they were engaging with me. They were listening critically to what I had to say. But then their eyes start glazing over. And I would notice this one student just had this faraway look in her eye. And I was talking, but she couldn't hear me. Her ears were still working, but she couldn't hear me. And I was standing in front of her, but she couldn't see me. It was like she was blind. And I asked her later on what was going on. She said, I was daydreaming about being at the beach. She heard the waves pounding against the shore, and she felt her boyfriend's hand in her hand, and she could smell the seafood that was cooking, and all these kinds of things. She could see the sun blaring down and all the sights. In her mind and in her inner hearing, she was in a different world. She had an altered state of consciousness. And I had to say, Sally, Sally, and I jerked her back. Okay, so what happens is that you can go into what's called an altered state in the alpha stage. And daydreaming is one of the things that you can do, but there's other things that you can do in the alpha state. My wife, we had 3 babies using the Lamaze method. And we learned that, guess what? You have to learn to breathe and meditate for 20 minutes or so. And when you do, that your body doesn't feel the pain as much. And you can go through childbirth. It's not painless, but without severe pain, because you've learned to slow down your brain rhythms and all this kind of stuff. Snake handlers pick up snakes when they reach the alpha state, when they walk into the service, they're alive and everything, but suddenly, because of the music and everything, they go into an altered state. At that point, they can lift up the snakes. People have intuition and they have insight when they reach the alpha state. So I realize there's an altered state that's different than our normal conscious state. And as I mentioned in the book, there's a theta state, which is our brainwaves slow down even more right before we go to sleep, right as we go to sleep, and as we're coming out of sleep. And during that time, we can have what seems to be supernatural experiences, spooky experiences. A friend of mine, Tom, woke up one day and saw a demon on his chest trying to choke him. And he cried out, "Oh, Jesus, help me," and the demon left. And he assumed it's because he cried out to Jesus that the demon left. And sometimes when people are going to sleep, they can see some shadowy figure in the room. I mean, I remember when I was in seminary, I was up real late at night one day, and I started to go to sleep, and suddenly saw this, what I thought was a demon in the corner of the room. But I discovered, as I was studying the brainwaves, that this is a common natural phenomenon when you're going into sleep and you're coming out of sleep. And so there were some people that actually think they've been caught up into some UFO mothership. They'll have this feeling that, because one of the experiences in the theta state is the experience of floating, and you feel like you're floating. I had a lady that fell asleep every afternoon, and she had 2 little kids, and she would float, and she claimed that she floated up to the ceiling of her apartment, and she could look down and watch her children playing. And she thought that was real, but really what it was, she was in a theta state. And then in the delta state, which is when your brain really slows down, you're totally unconscious, you're asleep. And during that sleeping cycle, the REM cycle, they have about 3 or 4 REM cycles, you can solve problems that your critical mind couldn't solve during the day. You can write poetry in your sleep. I remember reading about Spurgeon writing a sermon in his sleep. He went to bed at 11 o'clock at night. He could not come up with a sermon. He went to sleep, and guess what? He wrote the sermon in his sleep. Next day, he had the 3-point sermon that he wanted to preach. So these are things. This is why when some people say, "Well, I need to sleep on it. I've got a problem." Guess what? I need to sleep on it. When they sleep on it, they have the answer. The guy who invented the Singer sewing machine, he had a problem. He didn't know how. He needed a new kind of needle to make the sewing machine work. And he was asleep, and he had a dream, and while he was dreaming, he was captured by a group of natives in the darkest part of Borneo. And they put him in a pot, and they were going to boil him and eat him. They were cannibals. And they reached up their spears to kill him. And when it reached the spears up, he looked at the spear, and he noticed at the tip of the spear there was an opening. And when he saw that, he said, "Oh, I got the solution. My needle has to have an opening for it to work in a sewing machine." So the sewing machine needle was invented while he had a dream. So suddenly, it's great, isn't it? So I realized, okay, maybe psychics like my friend Ted Swagger simply put himself into a trance, into an alpha state, and was able to give us information. Wise information. answer our questions. Originally, he thought they came from the spirit world, but maybe it really just came from his subconscious mind. He was attuned to certain things. And so I started thinking about the power of the subconscious mind. So I went from all things are from God to all these things are from demons. Hey, maybe they're fake. And wait a sec. The power of the subconscious mind, it seems like it's supernatural what it can do. But it's very natural. It's just that we're not used to it. We're not cognizant of it. We're not aware. We haven't analyzed it that much. And now we're discovering through fMRIs and EEGs, all these kinds of tests, that when you have an altered state, whether it's in the alpha state or the theta state or the delta state, that certain things are going on in your brain and certain parts of your brain are lighting up. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian having a dream. I mean, the Bible talks about dreams and visions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter whether it's a Christian having a dream or a vision and God speaking through that dream or vision, or whether it's an agnostic having a dream or a vision and can invent a sewing machine needle. The same part of the brain lights up, whether it's a Christian or a non-Christian. And it can't be distinguished. And then I thought, well, let me ask myself a question. How could I tell whether something was demonic or whether something was from God when it comes to, quote, a healing or a word of wisdom or whatever? And I said, well, I really can't. The psychic, the people I dealt with were doing everything in the name of Jesus. And the charismatics were doing everything in the name of Jesus. Both were claiming the name of Jesus. And when I look back at the Bible, I see miracles, but I wasn't there to see what they were like. I wasn't there. All I know is that Jesus said something, somebody was healed. Peter said something, somebody was healed. I can't analyze that from 2,000 years later. So how do I know if Olga Warhol heals in the name of Jesus? She's a psychic. Dennis Bennett heals in the name of Jesus. He's a charismatic. What's the difference? It's too hard to discern. It's just too hard to discern. And for me to just simply label it demonic is a disservice. It's a judgment that's not based on any reality. So that's important. And I think the things that are happening in the Bible could very much be as mental as the subconscious things happening today. For example, when Peter's on the roof and he has a vision of a sheet coming down, look, that's happening in his mind. That's not objective, it's subjective. Had Mrs. Peter gone on the roof, she would not have seen that sheet coming down the mountain.
Sure.
See, Peter saw. So it tells you that it says Peter fell into a trance. He goes into what we today would call the alpha state. See? And so there is an explanation. That doesn't mean God can't speak through that. Why can't? Sure, God can use our brains. Why not?
Sure.
I read just a couple of weeks ago the story of the last book of the Harry Potter series, and Harry Potter's killed by his mortal enemy. I forget what the guy's name is.
Spoiler alerts.
Yeah,
it's Voldemort. It's the name that ought not be spoken, Alan. We know that. It's the name that ought not be spoken.
The name that can't be spoken. And so he's dead, and he goes to what we would call the ethereal world. He goes to King's Cross Station, which is a sort of an ethereal counterpart to the earthly King's Cross Station. And he meets his mentor there. And he says to his mentor, I think it was Dumbledore, well, it's not Dumbledore, I forget what it is. But he says to his mentor, he said, sir, have all these things that have been happening, were they real? Or did they happen in my mind? In other words, did all the things in those other volumes of Harry Potter that we read about, he said, were they real? Or did they happen in my mind? And his mentor says, of course they happen in your mind, but that doesn't mean they weren't real. So these things are real,
Right.
But that's how they happen. They're not totally necessarily objective. They're real. We
Right.
have to Now, the problem is what we have these experiences. Now we have to interpret them. That's the hard. And what happens is that people interpret these experiences based on their own worldviews. So a person has a near-death experience. They're on their operating table, and suddenly they see a tunnel, and they start going through this tunnel. And everybody has their own experience. If they have sort of a universal concept that everyone's saved, or they might say, well, I saw Uncle George. Uncle George was there, and he was reaching out and saying, come on in, son, come on in. Now, Uncle George died 20 years ago, but I saw Uncle George. Now, Uncle George was a drunk. He was a white beater. He was a no good. But guess what? Uncle George is quoting heaven. So that they see Uncle George in their near-death experience. Another one sees a light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe they hold to a pantheistic worldview. So that's what they see. Everybody interprets these altered state experiences based on their worldview. Or if they have no worldview, they're just confused. They ask, they'll come to you and say, what does this mean, Pastor? And you'll say, well, you interpret it based on your worldview. Or, So I guess what I'm saying is that we need to be careful not to judge too quickly and realize that God can heal in any way. He can heal by a doctor saying something's a galloping heart and the guy misinterprets it, and faith can be triggered just like that. It's amazing. Faith can be triggered by even misinterpreting a statement, and you can be healed. Just think so I'm convinced that the power of faith is really important in this whole thing. We haven't even talked about it, but in the book I talk about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. And they said,
that's crazy.
No one can break the 4-minute mile. But he did. And one moment he broke the 4-minute mile, guess what happened? Within 2 weeks, the next guy breaks it. And now it's been broken 1,000 times because people say, well, if he can do it, I can do it. That's the power of faith to do what seemingly is impossible.
Yeah. Goodness gracious. Yes. I mean, believability is obviously key. The placebo effect obviously is playing a role here in some respects. So like if we think that something helps us, even if there's no material reality connected to it, it can have some effect. Okay. We only have a couple minutes left here, but I'm really glad that we got that sweeping kind of view of how you worked through it. And you're very generous with allowing people to kind of get to walk through that journey with you. Here's maybe the $64,000 question near the end here. As somebody who, I mean, not to put you on the spot,
okay,
I presume that you still identify as a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ.
I believe in miracles because I believe in God.
Believe in miracles, believe in God, but so those are like what's, right? Miracles are nouns. They're what's. They're things that happen in the world, and then what your kind of worldview that you land on at the end of your book here, after kind of carefully building it, is a how, right? This is how a lot of things happen, right? The mechanism that we in the material world experience these kinds of things. But what's left on the table, I think, even I read carefully, and maybe I missed it, but I think what's left on the table is like the why, and like maybe the who that's kind of behind it, right? So if you're going so far as to say that like all what we describe as kind of spiritual manifestations have physical counterparts that are driving them, different brain waves and whatever, then really at the end of the day, is there a functional or a source difference between what we perceive as good and bad experiences, positive and negative manifestations? How do you think through, like, for example, I was kind of shocked at one point in time where you're citing all these examples, and then you cite the example that Paul himself, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, when he describes, I know of a man who went up to the seventh heaven or whatever it was, and that gets lumped into the same kind of, neurological brainwave apparatuses as you just kind of mentioned with Peter, and that, like, are we not comfortable, or could we not be comfortable saying, well, that was a God-initiated event for these people? Because our faith our Christian faith is very often built on, well, the core of it is being built on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, obviously. But if everything's explainable, then is that explainable too? And what happens if that becomes just something that we can measure by the way that people reacted to some sort of alpha wave to the brain. Hopefully you know the question that I'm
Let
asking
me
at this
just
point.
say a couple of things that come to my mind as I'm thinking this.
Yeah.
Many people have had paranormal experiences. That's number one. That does not mean that they are disciples or followers of Jesus Christ. Okay. I think many people have had an experience with God through these paranormal experiences. Maybe it's a healing. It doesn't matter. Maybe it's one of these, maybe they've had a vision and they sense God. God in that vision, whatever you want to say. That does not mean they are a disciple of Jesus Christ. So we have to separate salvation from these spiritual experiences. Spirituality is not necessarily Christianity.
Sure.
So that's number one. So salvation comes when we recognize that God has raised Jesus from the dead and has seated him as the ruler over the universe, whether people realize it or not. And he calls us to submit to King Jesus and become part of his kingdom now, because ultimately his kingdom will spread upon the entire earth. Okay, so that's more salvation thing. The other thought is that if the apostles were living today and they said, well, we cast out demons, would they have described that differently in modern day language? In other words, they were men using their own worldviews at that time, their own knowledge. They had certain scientific knowledge. If they were living today, would they have said, oh, this was not necessarily a demon the way we thought of it back then? Would they said something different? So we have to just ask that question. I don't know that it can be answered, but we have to answer that question. I believe in miracles. I was radically saved.
Yeah, you described your own experience. Yeah?
I was saved. That was a miracle. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He was stinking dead. That was a miracle. That cannot be repeated. A miracle is something that, number one, can't be tested in the sense of scientific tests making it repeatable. A miracle is a miracle. Jesus was raised from the dead. He raised people from the dead. But these things are repeatable. I can go into a meditative state. I can slow down my brainwaves. I may or may not have any. Just because you do that doesn't mean you're going to have a supernatural or psychic experience at all.
Right.
Right. You just relax. Most people never have necessarily a supernatural or psychic experience. But there are people who can go into a trance and they've learned how to do this and then allow themselves to be channels or vehicles for wisdom or whatever you want to call it. But that has nothing to do with Christianity. So what am I saying? I'm basically saying I'm dealing with phenomena. How do we determine the origin and the nature of the phenomenon? That's really my study, the origin and nature of the phenomenon. I would say that some of it is from God. That's a hard thing. How can you discern that? That's the hard part. Some of it, these things could be demonic. When is it demonic? When it's driving you away from God. When it's driving you away from Jesus. Let me just throw this out. I know we're running out of time, but this may just be something that's important. We know that Muhammad claimed to have a vision from God. Right? So I can say, he didn't have a vision from God. That was a devil. How do I know it was from the devil? I don't know if it was from the devil or not. He could have had an encounter with God. So what? That's not salvation. Just because you have it, Joseph Smith said he had a vision. He built a whole Mormon empire on this vision. Now, I could say he didn't have a vision. Now, he may not have. He may have been a faker. Right? Could have been demonic. I don't know. But he could have had some sort of vision. I don't know if he interpreted it correctly, but that doesn't mean he's saved.
Right.
Yeah. So we have to be very careful how we are labeling things. That's what we must be careful about. How do we label?
Right.
Don't label.
Right. It sounds like you are saying though that you do think, because at one point in time we could have construed that the whole book was saying that all psychic phenomena are neutral in their origin,
Not
like that they just are, and that thinking makes it so, or whatever, to use a Shakespearean turn of phrase, right? But But now I'm kind of hearing you say that it's conceivable that some origins of these psychic phenomena could be bad. We'll use the word demons. They could be contra God or whatever we want to say. There could be some not good sources of psychic phenomena. Is that do you still hold that to be the case in some respects?
There's only one place that I know where the Bible talks about lying signs and wonders in Thessalonians.
Right.
But the word pseudo signs and wonders, we have to say, does that mean they're fake?
Right.
Signs and wonders? In other words, can he give you some sort of fake vision? I would say that is a possibility. And I guess this is where discernment comes in. I think that most of the things that we label as demonic, though, are not demonic. That's our first go-to answer. I had a guy let me just tell one story. And you can cut this out if you don't, you want to, but I was a director of a Youth for Christ ministry. We had a big ministry where we had a rally every month. We had 1,000 kids come. Always had a guest speaker come in, an evangelist come in and speak. And this one Saturday night, I had a speaker come in, and when I introduced him to the audience, I said, "And here is my friend Charles Brown. He's a prophet of God. Listen to it." Okay. The next morning, now he's staying at my house over the weekend. The next morning, there's a knock at my door, and it's a member of my board of directors. And he is wild-eyed and disheveled, and he's banging at my door, and he's screaming, "See? See?" And my wife answers the door, and he comes in, he bursts through the door, and he throws himself down on the sofa and starts going out of control. I'm upstairs shaving. My wife says, "You need to come down here." And I got my friend Charles, and we come down, and he's curled up, and he's growling, and he's doing all these things. And we immediately said, "Well, he's demon possessed." We spent three hours working with this guy. He would fall on his knees, and he said, we'd say, "What's your name, demon?" He said, "Pride. I've got Neil." That was the guy's name, and Neil is mine. You'll never get him, Pride. And we would cast that demon out and do all these things. We were soaking wet and exhausted by the end of that trip. We took Neil home. His wife contacted a psychiatrist. He wasn't any better, but we calmed him down. His wife contacted a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist had prescribed him lithium. He never had another episode. So his problem was not that he had demons. His problem was that he had a psychosis of some sort, a medical problem that needed medical treatment, and he needed a prescription. And when he got his schizophrenia or whatever he had, was alleviated, it was under control. But we misinterpreted. Based on our worldview, we immediately said demon possession. And we worked so hard trying to cast those demons out. And we were mature Christians at this time. We were not just novices. We both had seminary degrees and everything. So this is an example where I think we mislabeled something. And where was this coming from? I know it's coming from his brain. He was having a psychotic episode. And once the doctor gave him the medicine, his problem was solved. So I don't have any problems with things coming, God speaking through the brain, just like was it real? Was it my brain or is it real? Well, it was in your brain, of course, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real. And here's the thing, whether it's Christian or non-Christian, the same areas light up when you're praying. And non-Christian prays, Christian prays, the same areas in your brain light up. So we know something's going on in the brain. The question is that how God's speaking to you? And you're speaking to God? Does he use our bodies, our natural way of speaking to us? Is it just something that happens if we go into a certain state? I can't answer all those questions. And that's why I say in the end of the book, there's so much, I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg here, There's so much more, and we need to really study this. But the one problem comes is that when you live in the 21st century, and the Bible was written in the first century, we weren't there. These guys are describing the phenomenon that they're saying, and we're trying to interpret it 2,000 years later.
Sure.
As a biblical scholar, I know how hard that is. It's not hard for a layperson; they can do it easily. But for somebody who studies the Bible, we have to go back to the first century. What did they teach? And if they say the sun stood still, well, I know probably the sun didn't stand still, but phenomenologically, it looks like it stood still. They're describing what they're seeing, but we know that that's probably not the case. See what I'm saying? There's that gulf that's between the first century and the 21st century. So we're learning a lot more. We're learning we're learning how God operates more.
Yeah. Well, there's a book that was released maybe 4 years ago, and it's spurred a podcast series that I'm obsessed with. It's called How God Works. And it really is just a look into the backgrounds of kind of spirituality and science. And I mean, this book of yours fits kind of squarely in that conversation, right? Like it's all about the how. It's the how. And I do think that your book has made a significant contribution in being able to think through kind of those mechanisms in some respects, right? Like understanding the background of what's happening in our foreground. And as you mentioned, obviously it leaves a lot of room for us to think going forward. What are we does this mean that everybody should seek, these manifestations because we know how to get them, right? Like that you're not proposing that everybody does that. You're not saying that you're not proposing some sort of monistic worldview where there's only the material world and nothing beyond it, right? We're still saying that there is ways for the ethereal plane to kind of connect with ours.
Right.
It's just we have a greater and greater understanding. Part of the challenge for us is that we do live in a God of the gaps scenario and have lived in the God of the gaps scenario really since the scientific revolution, right? And so many of us put our faith in whatever happens to be just over the horizon of our understanding, right? Whatever we say, okay, we can explain all this, but we can't explain that. And therefore, whatever that is God. And I'll put my faith there. And then like the next day, somebody comes along and explains whatever that was. And they go, oh my goodness, do I crumble? What am I supposed to do? So I really like your word of wisdom there about understanding, Christianity, following after Christ, is actually about literally following after the risen and exalted Jesus, right? That's
all of that.
That's the core, right? We have metaphysical things that we can kind of lean into, but at the end of the day, it's actually about a practice of life and how we live, not necessarily all the things that we have to believe and all these kind of check boxes. Yeah.
And we'll never be able to explain God because God is separate from us. He is another dimension totally. God is not in our brain.
God is not in our brain. Yeah,
that's right. Right. So there's a God who created us, who lives in the realm of eternity that we do not live in. Although there are people who have different opinions about that, but no, so God's not the next thing over the horizon that will be explained tomorrow. That'll never happen.
Right. Yeah. Oh, at least until your next book comes out anyway.
Until the next book. My next book.
Yeah. Dr. Streett, absolutely phenomenal. Like I said, I couldn't put it down. I highly recommend, if you guys are interested in it, you should definitely check it out. Exploring the Paranormal from Eerdman Publishing. I think this is going to come out. It comes out is it the beginning of November is when it's released? Is that right?
The release date, which the publicity guy thought would be a good idea, was to put it out on October 31st. Halloween.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Amazon has already been sending it out. So.
Oh, there you go. Okay, well, you can get it on spooky Thursday this year, October 31st, All Hallows Eve, or you can read it on All Saints Day the next day if you prefer to have that kind of covering for you.
Right.
Dr. Streett, thank you so much for your time. We're really truly appreciative of it.
Thank you very much. Good to meet with you.